we're going to talk about will technology disrupt the way we learn. And I want to mention that this particular discussion, we at NBC News, I am the education correspondent with NBC News, and we have joined in partnership with the Aspen Ideas Institute and the festival this week to present this particular forum. And we also want to mention that you probably have these little things on your seat. We're always doing advertising. That we have a little something called Education Nation that we're doing over at NBC. And come September, we're going to do for the third time a summit called Education Nations in September, from September 23rd. We hope you'll join us online and on the air when we continue the conversation that we're going to have here today about this very critical issue of looking for solutions of what's going to help our kids do the very best they possibly can at school. Now, when the folks who organized this thing got together, they said, let's have some really energized conversation, let's keep it smart, let's also have some fun. And in the spirit of that, they said, try to tell a joke. Well, I don't know very many jokes, but since we're talking about kids, I went back into a story that I did a few years ago, and I got a joke from a kid. So, 10 years old, asked a couple of questions of which I will share with you. And one of them was, can you tell me why is it kamikaze pilots wear helmets? I don't know. And the 10-year-old also said, can you tell me why is it when you're talking to God, you're praying, but when God's talking to you, you're crazy? From the mouths of babes, right? In that note, from children, let's go to the adults who are going to try and help children do the very best that they can at school. I think you know most of the people up here and what they do, and that is what brings you into the room. We don't have a whole lot of time, so I hope, will you all forgive me if I dispense with lengthy interviews? I mean, in terms of introductions. Is that okay? Okay, and we're going to jump right into it. And that is, again, to say, Joanne Weiss, Ted Mitchell, Randi Weingarten, and Miles Gilburne over at the end. And very quickly, Joanne Weiss, Chief of Staff, Education Secretary with Arnie Duncan, Ted Mitchell, President of New Schools Venture Fund, Randi Weingarten, President of the American Teachers Federation, and Miles Gilburne, CEO ePals, as you know, an education technology company that's focused on K-12. Everybody up here is thinking about kids, as are you. And to that, let me ask this question starting with Randi. There are a lot of people who look at the union, and you are probably, arguably, the most visible voice for teachers' unions in this country. And a lot of times, people say the unions are dragging their heels and preventing us in some ways from moving into this technology landscape. But I want to start with you, Randi, because the teachers' union has done something this week that says we're not dragging our heels, but we want to partner with you. Talk about that.
Thank you, and thank Aspen for letting us be a part of this. So this week, I was told by a couple of my education technologist friends that the AFT and our British partner has become the biggest disruptor in education, because what we've tried to do, and you know, I hope that one of these days we'll be viewed as the biggest advocate for teachers and kids, not the biggest advocate for unions. But what we did was we understood from all of these discussions we've had with teachers for all these years, and I'm in about 3 schools a week when I was the president of the UFT, and now I'm in at least 1 or 2 schools a week as the president of the AFT. Teachers are thirsty for knowledge and to share with each other and to break down the walls of anonymity. So we started what will become the biggest online resource platform that teachers have ever had with each other. And what the vision is that teachers helping each other, where they can upload and download information with and for each other, and all for free. The British company we have partnered with, TSL, Test Connect, and the AFT have invested about $10 million in the building of this platform. We call it Share My Lesson. We already have started with 200,000 resources, and for all of those who are really concerned about, can we actually get the Common Core implemented, virtually all of our resources are going to be aligned with the Common Core, so that when people share with each other, they'll have a sense that these resources are going to help teachers teach to the Common Core, which most teachers are going to have to teach to starting in September and have had very little experience or training about.
Miles, I want to bring you in quickly because I want to ask, do you perceive this, number one, as being something that moves the needle forward in terms of the unions assisting in this advent of technology in classrooms, advent in terms of it really affecting how children learn? Because we've had technology in classrooms for a long time, right? But do you see this as a move towards efficiency?
So I come from the Silicon Valley world, the high-tech world, the new company world, the disruptive world. And there's no doubt that the notion of teachers being able to share resources, share best practices, talk with each other is hugely important and is one of the things that technology can help. The interesting thing is, as admirable as this is, and it is very admirable, there are 4 or 5 other companies, some that Ted knows very well, that have funded up using venture capital money and are doing the same things and are putting them out there for teachers to come together and teachers to share. The fundamental question, though, the interesting question, as important as it is to allow teachers to start sharing, one of the big issues is the kinds of curriculums and projects that teachers are going to share with each other and discuss with each other. You still have that fundamental issue in the United States about why is it that teachers will have the flexibility and the freedom to implement new kinds of learning activities in the classroom. It's sort of a species of the question we have about how do you bring social networking into a classroom? Well, how do you take teachers that are teaching to the test, are being scripted in what they do every hour, and that are focused on old standards, not new standards. So the Common Core standards are fundamentally transformational for this company. It's finally shifting us away from fact-based learning and low-bar testing and scripted teachers to focusing on skills, focusing on critical thinking and problem solving and communication. And in that context, because it's hard to know how to teach those skills, those are more difficult, the opportunity for teachers to come together and share best practices on what they're discovering, how they're evolving, their practice in order to meet the Common Core is hugely valuable. Whether our system gives the teachers the freedom to do it is a separate issue. And in my...
Joanne, I want to bring you in. The Department of Education has been instrumental in moving the ball forward in terms of the adoption of Race to the Top, whether or not districts are going to look at raising the bar in terms of standards. How do you think technology and Common Core is going to factor into this?
So I think technology is just a critical tool for really scaling effective practices and what we call sort of powering up teachers and giving them a whole bunch of new tools to be more effective and more efficient at their jobs. The challenge for entrepreneurs is to make tools that really do that, which we've had a hard time doing in education. We haven't always made tools that make it more efficient. We've often made tools that make it actually more work and harder for teachers to figure out how to use these and integrate them in the system. I think that's really starting to change. You can see a real inflection in the last few years of tools that are now starting to really catch on and really help teachers do a much better job of teaching.
And Ted, you would agree with that? I mean, that's part of what you were really focused on, tools that provide ways for teachers to be more efficient and helping students learn.
Yeah, I think efficiency is certainly a part of it. Effectiveness in helping teachers teach kids to achieve higher learning objectives is really the goal. So I also want to endorse the Common Core as a real game changer in this. I think that it finally allows teachers to be teaching the kinds of things they want to teach, and for our students to be learning the kinds of skills that will make them truly competitive and also contributory to our democracy. I'd like to go back for a second to the Share My Lesson platform. And I also think it's quite commendable that the union has done this. And to Miles' point, there are other organizations that are also doing similar things. Better Lesson, Learn Zillion, the Teaching Channel, Torch, small entrepreneurial companies. What's great about what's going to happen next is that instead of arguing about whether we should be doing something, we get to argue about which of these toolkits is providing teachers with the right tools at the right time to do this increasingly complicated job. And that's what's really breakthrough about this, is that we in this area, we can stop arguing about whether and start arguing about how and start to look at effectiveness. Tim Brown, in the last session in this room, made an eloquent point about the faster you iterate, the faster a system evolves. And I think that that's, for me and for where we sit at New Schools, that's one of the things that we've got to keep our eye on, is this need to iterate, to not try to land on something that's going to be a fixed solution forever, but to work hard to create power tools for teachers at just the time they're moving into this challenging Common Core arena.
And the question I have is, what do you think is happening now that allows people to feel more excited about this? Again, as I say, we've seen technology. Today is not the first day we're talking about this. We've talked about it for a while. Why is it you think that there is a possibility we might actually see it being effective in changing the way students learn in schools? Miles?
So learning is social, and we know that. We know that people learn in many respects better from peers than they do from adults. We know that heterogeneous learning environments are important, mentors as well as teachers, as well as parents, as well as students. And one of the things that the Common Core is all about, when you focus on teaching critical thinking, problem solving, communication to diverse audiences, social tools map really well onto those skills. The ability for kids to have to connect with each other and collaborate with each other and communicate with each other teaches them how to write, teaches them how to communicate authentically. All of the skills-based learning that we're shifting over to in the standards, and by the way, it's not just the US. Around the world, the standards are even more ambitious. I mean, countries around the world have recognized the need to move to standards that focus on skills. And technology, particularly, at least in my world, social media technology that allows kids around the world or around the corner to connect with each other, with teachers, with mentors, to do project-based learning and to learn together, I think is going to be the real driver in moving performance against the Common Core standard. So I don't only think that it's a question of, can technology do it? I think it's actually fundamentally important that we bring technology in now, because that's the way I think we're going to teach a lot of the next generation skills that are needed.
You know, I've heard this before. Every time I hear it, people say, let's do it now. Again, I'm trying to get to the point of what makes this different now, Joanne, in terms of the urgency to do it?
I think there's a few things that have changed in the marketplace. I do think social media is a big one. I think another big one is that the Common Core has been adopted by so many different states, 45 states plus DC, that there's now a nationwide market for these things that didn't exist before, which gives entrepreneurs a real marketplace to go after. Will also let teachers in Mississippi trade lessons with teachers in Massachusetts, trade lessons with teachers in Colorado. They'll be able to share professional development. They'll be able to share lesson plans. There's just a whole lot of stuff that we're going to be able to do now in the market we couldn't do before. A third thing is the new assessments that are coming out that are being developed by these two large assessment consortia that will be designed against these Common Core, so testing a whole new set of standards. They're required to be online. So that's going to bring technology right into every single school in the country. And so if that technology is in there for the 1 day a year that you're going to do testing, the other 364 days a year, you better do some really great things with that technology because it's going to be available now. And the last thing I'll say that I think makes a big difference is mobile computing and tablets. I think that when you had computer labs and desktops and laptops, kids were kind of hidden behind this barrier of the technology. And when they've got like cell phones and tablets and things that are just sort of part of the desk and part of their world, and they're just carrying it around with them, it changes a lot of the culture of how you use technology in schools.
I'd add two more. I think that the kids themselves are digital natives in ways that no generation has been before. So you go into the KIPP school in Los Angeles, or the Alliance high schools in Los Angeles, and you see kids who are completely comfortable in this environment, expect it, and are actually probably putting devices away in order to come to school.
Put your computer back,
Put it back in the bag. So my daughter going to junior high school and middle school in Southern California is not allowed to bring a device into the building.
Right.
That doesn't work.
Okay, and to that point.
But the second piece is that the teachers are also digital natives, and so they are very comfortable in this environment.
The new teachers coming in.
So,
The new ones.
but can I want to riff off of Ted's point and off of Walter's point. We are also at the moment that this can become the next new shiny object, particularly because of all the cuts in schools. So people think, okay, this will substitute for all the cuts in schools. I think that the issue is we've had technology in schools for a long time, and we spent a lot of money on it. And there's a lot of smart boards in a lot of classrooms that are not utilized well. And I think that the issue that Walter raised, I think is more, I mean, I know we're with entrepreneurs, and this is a great marketplace for you, but for me, it's about effectiveness, and it's about what's going to really happen. And I think that this issue is that we now have all these teachers, 3 million teachers in 46 states and DC, having to actually adopt and implement in August and September a curriculum that very few of them have any experience with or knowledge about. And so teachers are actually really thirsty for some tools. That's what I think is different. Because what's happening is that their districts are not giving them the tools to actually teach, to align their teaching to the skills that kids really need to know going forward. And so this issue about project-based learning and going deep, we don't have, as school teachers, what we've done up until now, particularly under the No Child Left Behind regimen, is to do rote memorization, teach to the test. So you have this kind of convergence of more rigorous teaching and a need for kids to have that against a current accountability system that is basically built on rote memorization. That's why teachers are starting to look and say, we need help, someone help us. And so I think that's why you're seeing that push. And then on top of that, what you're seeing is that kids are much more nimble with technology so that they're thirsty for that integration.
There's something that's happening around the country called BYOT, Bring Your Own Technology. The question I ask for our panelists is, I saw this in action in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago. I went down there and a kid was doing some great work. He got some of his facts wrong with BYOT, and we helped him out with that, but it's exciting. My question is, how do you help that kid who doesn't have a BYOT, who has a cell phone, but most of our kids are not accessing the internet on their cell phones. They're just chatting and tweeting. So for the kid who goes into an environment in a school community, it's a low-income school, is there going to be money? Will there be an infusion of investment so that that school will be able to provide for those youngsters in some schools where these kids qualify, 98% of the kids in some of these schools qualify for a free lunch program. So what we're saying here is that these children don't have money in some sense. What do you see as a panel up here of how you're going to help those children not fall behind in this push to BYOT? Joanne?
Well, look, for so long we've defined equity as put all your devices away. Equity means we're going to buy the same thing for all 30 of you, and if we don't have 30 of them, nobody can use them. In this BYOT world, it's like everybody take whatever you've got out of your backpack. Now we only need to buy 5 things or 10 things for the 5 or 10 of you who need those things. It's actually a much more cost-effective way to provide real technology access to every single kid in the school. We just need to get out of the way of the rules and the way of thinking that we've had so far about this.
Ted, your impression of this?
Yep. So yes to Joanne's point. I think in addition, a lot of the developers we're working with and the small companies we're working with are starting with the assumption that people are going to use multiple devices to access the stuff. And so they're building interfaces that then allow for the variety from the low-end smartphone to the high-end laptop to have virtually the same access to the material and the same access to the user interface through a variety of different mechanisms. So I think we're rapidly closing the digital divide from both the device up and the software down.
But we're not there.
But we're not there. And in the middle, and there are a number of philanthropists in the room here who are working hard to make it possible for there to be the laptop cart that then is present in free and reduced price lunch scenarios. And that's going to continue to be important for a while.
And Miles, I mean, how will you change the scenario, do you think, in places like New York City, where I live? And Randi, you know, how many kids do we have in New York City public schools? Since we're talking about 1 million kids, currently they are not allowed to bring their cell phones into the school.
Right.
So what's going to be the language? How are you going to convince the policymakers to change the policy so that can happen, if you think it needs to happen?
So,
Okay, actually, if I could, I just want to make one comment on the equity side of it, because there are a couple of trends that are really helpful in this regard. One is if you stop for a minute and think about education as a media for a moment, and you look at what's happened to all other forms of media in a digital and networked world, you see the transformation from physical products and physical channels, expensive, to digital products with no marginal cost of goods, to digital distribution channels with no marginal cost of distribution. That's disruptive because it takes the costs of educational products and changes them radically. Cloud computing also helps all the school districts now because it takes all the cost of enterprise computing out of the enterprise. So what we're setting up now is a situation where cost of devices is going down. The new entrepreneurs that are thinking about the new curriculums that are going to map onto the Common Core are thinking about not textbook pricing, we're thinking about different business models. So there's a real convergence of things that will make education resources cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, which I think will be very helpful. The second question of what do you do from a policy point of view in terms of bringing them in? So at EPALS, this is a big issue for us because we connect classrooms around the world in the classrooms for kids and students and teachers to communicate with each other and collaborate with each other. And we spend a lot of time on two issues. What makes this effective and interesting, right? How do we look at efficacy? And that goes to how do we think that project-based learning and collaborative learning maps onto new standards. That will break open the doorways. But the second issue for a lot of technology is it's not the same thing as leave your devices out because they disrupt classroom, but how do you bring things into the classroom in a way that's safe? Because you can't, when we connect kids that are in 3rd grade with adults that are mentors to read books together, so focusing on safety and security is a big issue, and that's a big gating item.
And Randi, you want to speak to that, and also speak to this point too, of whether technology will unite or divide. There's a question of that, will it be the great equalizer or the great divider? You've been talking about how some communities want to bring in technology, and we talk about will technology disrupt how we learn? Well, if there's no broadband in some of these communities, it won't happen. Randi?
So let me just say, I called Miles Walter because he looks like one of my best friends, so my bad. I actually want to push back on something that Joanne said, and it goes to Rehema's point, which is I live in a world where there are a lot of have-nots, where poverty has been increasing, where the American Working Families Network has gone down by 40%, and where a lot of kids don't actually, they have some devices, but they don't have all the kind of devices that we're talking about. And we have a lot of have-nots, and the issue in terms of equity is a huge one and should not be dismissed. Wait. So number two, all I'm saying is that, so you take McDowell County, West Virginia, where our union is actually engaged in a project to revitalize the entire county. It is like what Jeff Canada has been doing in Harlem. It's like what's happened in terms of Cincinnati. This is the 8th poorest county in the United States of America, Cole County, Appalachia. There is no broadband in the county right now. So in one of the 2 high schools, if you actually do and operate the security system, there is no internet access for anyone else. And so I do actually agree with Miles' point that long term, this is going to be cheaper because of the cloud and whatever, but you also need to have the immediate investment at the very same time as in virtually every state in the nation, there has been a cut in the investment. So I'm just doing a little bit of a reality check in terms of the world that I live in, which is lots and lots of families are poorer and poorer, and we need to actually figure out this equity issue.
And so just to be clear, that's the same world I live in. And all I was saying is equity is critically important, but if we keep trying to solve it by buying 30 of the same thing, and if we can't afford to buy 30, we're not buying any, that's the wrong way to solve the problem. There are much cheaper ways to solve the problem. So that's all I was saying. I'm totally with you on the equity issue being huge. I also think that this question of is technology the great equalizer or the great divider is a really big question for us where the jury is still out. And to the extent that entrepreneurs start going around schools to consumers and saying parents are my customer, not schools, we're going to increase and really exacerbate this technology divide. And it happens because schools are really bad consumers and bad purchasers very often of these technologies. They don't quite know what to do. They don't know how to integrate it. They're not good at absorbing new innovations. And we really need to get at this problem and fix it, or else we will have a really big problem here going forward.
Ted?
Yeah, can I follow up on that? Because I think I want to play a little bit with the great equalizer or the great divider question. I think it ought to be the great divider. Pause. Because I think that we haven't really talked about the technology yet, aside from talking about its utility in a social environment. One of the things that has happened is that the power of the technology itself has allowed us to, as teachers, as administrators, to be in much closer touch with what kids know and are able to do in a real-time basis. So the adaptive properties of the new technology provide us the opportunity to individualize instruction in ways that would have been a dream for all the teachers who were brought up, Randi, when you came into the profession. And so
I'm old.
In that sense, the technology ought to be able to divide education in ways that are most effective for individual kids in a classroom. Where Joanne's point becomes so important is that the very power of that technology makes it hugely attractive to parents. Because a parent doesn't look at a room of 30 kids, a parent looks at one. And so if I, as an entrepreneur, can offer Joanne, as a parent, a tool that can address my kids' needs, that's a sale, or that's a free download. But because schools are so bad at consuming this product that differentiates, it makes it too tempting, I think, for entrepreneurs to be out there selling to the consumer market, where they're selling to an N of 1, rather than to a school or a district where they're selling to an N of 30 or 2,000 or 600,000. And we've got to help districts and schools be better at that.
So this is really, Ted's point is actually really interesting. And Jeffrey Kennedy at a conference I was at a couple of weeks ago said something very similar, which is when somebody said, well, what do you need from these entrepreneurs and innovators that are in this room? I think you were there. Mm-hmm. He said, do me a favor. When you come to me with something, have some experience to back it up. Because ultimately, there's going to be a lot of different experiments and innovations that sound good initially and can be marketed incredibly well, and people have a thirst for it. But unless there's some experience behind it, we're going to be buying lots and lots of new things where we don't know whether it has any kind of track record whatsoever. And that's, I think, the worry that we're all expressing. Technology is really important. We have to integrate it into our teaching. It's very powerful when you integrate it into teaching in a really good way. It reinforces, it helps remediation, it helps creativity, but the real issue becomes what products are good and what products are not. Sure. And who defines that?
And to that point, this is a multi-billion-dollar business. And I think there's a statistic out there that something like $2.2 billion was spent last year from school districts, by school districts, on bringing technology into their classrooms. And I want to ask this panel, do you have any evidence that not just the $2.2 billion that was spent last year, but the billions that have been spent already? Talk to me about what you are seeing. What does research tell you about all the billions of dollars that have been spent? Where have we narrowed the achievement gap? How have we increased the graduation rate? Where have we reduced the dropout rate? Can you point to the studies of anyone, pick up and share what you have learned in that regard?
Well, sure. Go ahead.
Please take that one.
Only if you follow on. You know, and the federal government has done good work on this, leading work on this. But I think, Randi mentioned this morning, I think that the grosser our categories, the less we learn. And so in the same way that it's probably not a good discussion to talk about whether charter schools are better or worse than other kinds of schools, it doesn't work to talk about technology as a unified bunch. So there are clear studies that show the efficacy of individual technologies in education environments. But what's key to that is that the technology doesn't exist on its own. It's always implemented in a human system with teachers and kids and parents. And so the implementation is oftentimes as important, if not more important, than the technology tool itself. So it'd be like saying, is this hammer going to be more effective than this screwdriver? Well, it really depends on whether the problem needs a hammer or a screwdriver, and it depends on the ability of the person managing the tool to wield the hammer or the screwdriver. And so when you put those together, you bet. And so I think what we all need to do, to the point that Randi was making, is figure out what the combination of problem, tool, and implementation best works together, and to celebrate those and advertise them and scale them up in ways that we haven't before.
One thing that I think is promising for the future is that we don't have an FDA in education. We don't have we've tried over the years, but it's never been successful to actually have a process whereby companies that are creating new curriculums actually have to submit it to rigorous evaluation as to efficacy. And there are a lot of reasons for that, many of which deal with how difficult it is to actually evaluate physical products in messy environments. It's tough to control variables in education when you're dealing with a very complex physical operating environment. But the interesting thing about technology is that changes that. Because all of a sudden, and we know this from consumer media, all of a sudden you can do this in 1,000 classrooms, this in 1,000 classrooms, this in 1,000 classrooms digitally, and you can control variables, and you can capture work product, and you can capture metadata, and you can begin to do assessment on efficacy in much more meaningful ways, I think, than you've ever been before. So if there was one thing I would love to see the federal government do, is go back to some of the things that it tried to do decades ago and say, well, how do we actually now look more closely at efficacy on an empirical scientific basis? And I think that will be very helpful in the future, and I think we can do it more cheaply going forward than we were in the past.
The one thing we do know is that online learning per se has not been very effective. And my friend Andrew Tisch has run K-12 Inc., which is almost like a regular school district. And the New York Times did lots of studies and exposés about this in the last few months that show that lots of kids who are having simply online learning have not actually made the grade. And so I think that the issue becomes, and I think Ted got there, is that there's an integration here that makes it very hard to actually isolate any particular factor. So just like it's hard to isolate the particular efficacy of all teachers, it's hard to isolate the particular efficacy of individual technology. There's a bunch of things, this is what makes education so complicated. There's a bunch of things that you have to actually do together to actually increase the graduation rate, decrease the dropout rate, create the efficacy that we're talking about. We've all talked about the core curriculum. A curriculum doesn't implement itself. Right. It's important to have the who teaches and the what, and then also to deal the how, and then to also deal with, in a real-time basis, all the other issues that kids have. And so I think that the issue is interesting on this. We can't, that's why there's no silver bullets in education, but why this is a really powerful tool of integration.
So Just to add a couple of facts in here. As you say, online learning and the opportunities for it is rising in America. From 2002, we had 1.2 million students engaged in some kind of online learning. In 2010, it went over 6 million. And in 2006, Michigan became the first state to require online learning of some course in order to graduate. Since then, Alabama, Florida, and Idaho have added a requirement in high school that you cannot get out of high school unless you can successfully complete an online learning course. So we're moving ahead in this arena, maybe disrupting how students are learning, or maybe disruption is not the right word. Maybe we are adding, maybe there's added value, but are we still in the infancy of trying to determine the real value of it, Joanne? Are we still at the early stages of this experiment?
Yes. All you have to do is walk into almost any school in America, and you will know that the answer to that is yes.
And the panel would agree? Yes. Ted?
Very early.
Absolutely. I think that again, going back to this point about iterating and being happy learners as we go through this, it's going to be really important for us to keep track of how students are using these new tools in both higher ed and in K-12. But I think that we are at the very early moments of this from both the learner's point of view and the teacher's point of view.
As we go forward, as we look way into the future, maybe it is not so distant. There are some who are very idealistic and think that one day we will really disrupt the model of education and how we learn in this country. And we've blown up the little one-room schoolhouse from Little House on the Prairie. We don't do that anymore. We've got anywhere from 4,000 to 4,500 kids learning in institutions across this country. We've got big environments of learning. Are those going to become obsolete? Miles, do you see that going away? Will the institution of the traditional schoolhouse, however we see it now, will technology disrupt that?
Well, it mutates it. What happens is learning becomes 24/7. You can learn from home, but you also have reasons to be in school. The flipped classroom that has students doing things at home digitally so that then the teachers can focus on different things in the classroom. I know in my company, it's very interesting because when we connect classrooms around the world, we're not actually doing it around a specific curriculum, but we know, for example, that language learning is very important around the world. And language learning is something that you can practice when you collaborate around anything, wicked problems of the world, tsunami hits, kids get together and collaborate. So there's an example where an online environment that's both classroom to classroom and kids from home have the ability to do things together and learn together. It doesn't get rid of the classroom itself, but it supplements it and it mutates the classroom. And I suspect it'll be, as it's been with most technology, it'll be a gradual evolution where you have more hybridization of physical and digital learning, more hybridization of classroom and home learning, and I hope more hybridization of local learning and international learning.
The one thing, so I would like to see one day that we do get out of the factory model of education that we have right now. Our model of education is not an agrarian model, it is a factory model. And what digital learning will help do that, I think, hugely. But the real, at least vision that at least this one teacher would have is that our schools become centers of community and that we bring people in and that we use technology to connect people all across the world, but that the schools become that center because at the end of the day, relationships really matter. And we need to have kids really understand and have relationships with and by one another. And we need to ensure that communities, which is how America has operated for years, that communities get revitalized. And so I see technology as a way of really integrating this and helping us and exciting kids and engaging kids and also connecting the world.
Joanne, do you agree? I mean, there are some people who see that school buildings have been very useful, particularly in communities that we talk about, low-income communities, communities of color, that the physical school building has been an image of stability in communities that have been very unstable. Do you see that going away? If those communities gain more stability, will they go away? Should they go away?
No, I mean, I totally agree with Randi on this. I think that schools always have been and need to remain the sort of hub of these communities. They need to be open much more than they are. They need to invite after school, forget all these different after school clubs having different buildings around the community. Come into the school, bring all those resources in, figure out how to integrate them. Schools are going to remain, I think, a critical hub in these communities, but physically they do need to look different. This like one room with 30 kids and one teacher repeated, room after room is not conducive to the kind of learning that we're all talking about here. So what these buildings look like will matter. The design of this does matter, and we will be having to take those questions on in the future. But I think that school buildings will remain a critical part of our community ecosystems.
We've been talking up here now for about a half an hour, and I want to engage you in the audience in this conversation. And I invite you to ask questions of our panelists. I know this is a brave new world, and in many instances, there doesn't seem to be a particular roadmap of how we get to the place where we want kids to go. But I'm always heartened by the fact that the Wright brothers weren't pilots either. They didn't have a pilot's license. And yet most of us got here by a little bird with wings. So I'm ever hopeful. There's a question. The microphone is close here, so let's start there.
Yeah, hi, my name's Pete Lofiego. I'm a principal in Michigan, and I have a question for you. Do you think technology will help us settle? I've been in education for 14 years, and it's changed every 2 years, whether it's technology or standards or the roadmap. And part of that is what paves such a difficult path for us to weave. And so I'm wondering if you feel as a panel, anyone can answer it, if technology is that binder that might finally bring some kind of cohesiveness to curriculum and technology education.
Randi, let's start with you.
So, it reminds me of teachers all the time say, well, this will come and go. This is the fad of the month, the curriculum of the year, and then something new comes in. And as a result, no one really gets to really learn it, own it, and be able to teach it in a great way. In some ways, you think about if a concert pianist every single few months or every single year had to totally change their music and start something new. You don't, so I think that's where the question is coming from. I think we're going to see in education constant change. I think the real issue becomes, I hope, that we will stick with the core curriculum for a little while, enough that we don't throw out this iteration of standards. I know people are very concerned that testing will trump the standards, but if we could actually stay with core curriculum and then use technology as a way to help integrate and understand and learn it so that we're helping kids, that would be a good thing.
Ted, would you jump in here, and then Miles?
Yeah, so there's a part of technology that we've not spent enough time on here, which is what really undergirds it all, which is the ability to collect massive amounts of data in real time. It gets to Miles' point about being able to design evaluation systems. We can do so in one sense it's going to feel a little bit crazier because we'll be doing lots of quicker experiments. But the good news is that we're instead of just, well, we're going to change from this to that because there's been a change of administration in the school district or a change in leadership at the state. Instead, we actually have a running chance to be able to say we should change when something works better than something else. And the data that's going to be produced by the technology that we've been talking about is going to be the lever that I think is going to be that binding force that you mentioned.
Yeah,
And Miles?
but I think the news is actually sort of bad on this issue for you. I like to think, actually, I think the history of technology in other markets will reinforce that. Because while hopefully things like, if you take the Common Core and you say that's a new regimen, and let's assume that settles in and sticks for a while, but the message behind that about teaching skills and a lot of the things that the Common Core is all about really force you to a different model of teaching, a much more flexible model of teaching, a much more creative model of teaching, breaking down the strictures and the barriers of how you do things. And technology actually accelerates that, because in every other industry, what does technology do other than give and empower individuals to be more flexible, more changeable, more variable. So I actually think the challenge is going to be technology is going to force an acceleration in teaching methodology. So of all the needs, actually, it's teacher training and teacher professional development around how to cope with the fact that we have a new regimen that's going to force teachers to change and adopt rapidly, and technology is going to accelerate that and make it more imperative that you do that. So I think this is a challenging time, a very exciting time for teachers, because I think you get out of the old box and you get to actually be professionals in ways that you haven't been before, but I think it's difficult.
And where's the time that we need to be able to get that done?
I want to, the microphone is now in the hand of Eli Brode. Welcome. It's good to see you. Not yet. Let's see if we can fix that. Can we fix this microphone or get him another one?
Try again.
I hear you, but I don't think the rest of the room
There's
can.
the technology.
Yeah, that's one of the failures in technology. It doesn't always.
Should I try? I've got this one,
Okay,
and I can.
it's on now. We're going to get this fixed.
Hi, Eli Brode Foundation. You know, the American classroom hasn't changed in 100 years. The biggest change is instead of a blackboard with chalk, we've got a whiteboard with marker pens. I can think of no other part of American society that's not using technology. We've got to go to blended learning. We're in the early innings. There are a lot of examples of blended learning, whether it's High Tech High, several schools in California, rocket ship schools in Northern California, the Alliance Charter School, public charter schools in Los Angeles, and others. And I think those are proof points that it's really working. And the sooner we adopt similar blended learning models, the better off we're all going to be.
Joanne, do you agree with that in terms of the blended learning? It is happening in schools across the country.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of good examples. There's the examples that Eli mentioned. In addition, there's examples in traditional school districts. So the Mooresville School District in North Carolina has done phenomenal things with blended learning that propelled them from like the 99th district out of about 101 in the state up to number 3, and they're hoping to head to number 1 shortly. School of One in New York is being used in New York public schools in a very sophisticated blended learning model that's very differentiated, both for teaching and for the teachers, as well as for the students who are in that model. So I totally agree that this is the direction that we're heading.
And the good news is that there is a market now for organizations that will help school districts do that blending, education elements, Junio, organizations that will start with a superintendent and say, sure, we can help you integrate technology in a way that blends the best of what the computer can do as a tool with the best of what teachers can do in terms of building relationships with kids. KIPP Empower in LA became the highest performing school in a 2-year turnaround, 2 years from its start.
There are a lot of proof points out there. And it's not only in K through 12 education. We've got online learning at higher ed. And now you have Harvard and MIT joining forces and believing they can deliver education as well online as they can in a classroom.
Thank you. Another question out there? We've got one right there.
Hello, I've got a question for the panel. My name is Pat Kuhl, and I'm a neuroscientist at the University of Washington in Seattle. So the question I have is, we're studying children while they learn, and one of the things that we're noticing, maybe not so surprising, is that brains light up during face-to-face interaction. We are social human beings. We love learning from one another. We can read intentions and discover things that you can't, under other mediums. So when I see families of 4 with everybody's head down to their personal technologies at a restaurant, or classrooms and when kids have their heads down, each trying to, discover something from their personal technologies, I worry about how and I'd like the panel to speak to innovations in technology that will make technology help people interact face-to-face, putting information up someplace where kids can both look at each other and look at the teacher and look at whoever is online from some other country and share information, capitalizing both on technology and face-to-face, which is what the brain lives on.
Miles?
You just described Miles'
You did.
work.
So what we do at EPALS is we connect classrooms around the world, and we give them a way to identify projects that they want to collaborate on. And then we give them a way, whether it be with Skype in a synchronous face-to-face way, or whether it be with videos that one kid in one classroom creates and shares with kids around the world. It's exactly that premise, is we believe that project-based learning, collaborative learning, when we say face-to-face though, we like to think about both synchronous and asynchronous. And we also like to use not just video, but we believe in all forms of communication. So we look at projects that enable all forms of communication to be used locally in groups, but also nationally and globally in groups. And we see that the kids are highly motivated to do that. And there actually is a fair amount of research on the efficacy of collaborative learning as a model. So I think, again, it goes back to this question of social networking, especially if you can do video as well as all the other data types, basically addresses exactly what you said. And it happens that the Common Core standards, because what they demand are these skills that it turns out maps really well onto what social media allows to happen. So what we'll do is we'll see the convergence now of neuroscience saying let's have those kinds of connections with the Common Core standards that are saying the kind of activities that enable teaching the Common Core standards, I think are going to be very, very positive from your perspective.
There's no question there's a challenge, though. You know,
Right.
there's the statistic out there that says our young kids now spend about 58 hours a week on electronic devices. So that means they're not talking to one another face to face. So Randi, how do you answer this question
So
as
so this is going to be a really big challenge because we know that the pedagogy that Miles is talking about is exquisite pedagogy. And when that actually happens, I've seen that in the portfolio schools in New York. I've actually seen the best example, frankly, of blended learning in New York is not the School of One, but the P-Tech schools that IBM is doing with a group of schools in New York City. But this notion of collaborative learning and this notion of project-based learning and teaming will really be essential to get people out of their digits and out of this. And so, but this is the fight on our hands, and I want to raise it this bluntly. It takes time. Kids learning this way is amazing and catalytic, but it takes time to create that kind of classroom and that kind of environment. And so the real issue becomes, are we going to be persistent or are we going to be urgent? The persistence in terms of ensuring that kids really are learning in a deep way and that are career and college ready, that will be our challenge.
I want to get another question in here. You point the microphone, that's good.
Is it on? Oh, there you go. Mandy Siebert from Facebook Communications. Curious, I want to connect back to the last session that was in here, Tim Brown talking about some design philosophies. To what extent do you think that administrations and teachers really adopt the philosophy of iterating, trying to optimize as they go, launch to learn, and how do you think we might be able to kind of inspire more of that?
I mean, I think the cultural problem is the fundamental problem that we have to address in order to really integrate technology beautifully into schools. You know, one of the things that I think Tim said in the last session was that organizations that are built on inflexible rule sets are hard ones to take up this sort of continuous improvement iterative philosophy, and that defines governmental organizations, period, whether they're schools, state governments, federal government, as I know well at this point. And so this is the challenge, because we have to have schools that are built on a philosophy of continuous improvement, and that means you take risks, you get the data, you make corrections, and you try again. And that's just not the philosophy that schools in general have been built on, but it's critical to making all of this work. I do think schools want to move in that direction. I think teachers hunger for this. So I think there's a lot of will to go there, but there's not a lot of experience yet.
So I completely agree, and I want to connect what Eli said with what Randi said. The other thing going against school systems is that the foundational logic of schools was built in the factory era. And the logic was, just as in a factory, you build the assembly line, and then it is by nature efficient, and it will continue to produce.
And it scales.
And it scales. And if you think about, Miles has been good about reminding us of change in other industries. If you think about what it took to bring about fundamental change in the American manufacturing industry, you have a bit of an insight into what it's going to take to change the culture in the educational system. My doctoral advisor wrote a great book about the building of the American education system called The One Best System. And we have to just commit ourselves to not trying to find again the one best system.
Exactly right.
But to iterate around a set of common core standards in a way that will allow us to experiment, but not feel as if we're throwing the whole thing up for renegotiation every time we iterate.
Exactly. Because this principal from Michigan, we need him to stay and not get so frustrated that he leaves. Because with that, he takes all of his knowledge and incredible skill. And so think about these three words: tools, time, and trust. That's what teachers hunger for. And so part of it is, if we're going to take a risk, people are going to stumble. And so ultimately, we need to be fair enough to allow them to stumble and then get up and try something new again.
And by the way, assessment can be so pernicious when you come up with instruments that are the thing I worry about is an environment of iteration and experimentation, and we don't exactly know what works, and even when something works, we don't know if it's going to scale, and we want to encourage teachers to be innovative and principals to be innovative. But if you have instruments that are low bar assessments that really force all attention to be teaching to that test, then we are not going to end up with an environment of iteration and change.
So Miles was the one who said, end the testing fixation, not Randi. But
yes.
I think that point that he just made, that Miles just made, is absolutely essential if we're going to move to a new iterative, continuous improvement model.
Question over here.
Howard Gardner from the Harvard Graduate School of Education.
Hi, Howard.
I want to go back to something that was touched on and people sort of nodded, but I think it's actually a much knottier problem. And that is that I think that people with any kinds of means who get involved in learning technologically is going to be basically a centrifugal force. People will learn what they want to learn the way they want to learn it. You know, they'll learn it at home, they'll go to Khan Academy. If they want to get together with a group, they'll do it on a much more ad hoc basis. And the centripetal forces are going to be much weakened. Now, you all nodded, yes, the school should be the center of the community and people should go there and gather. And in fact, that's been a very important part of American communitarianism. Basically, schools and the military were the two venues where people who didn't have to be together if they weren't in school or in the military got together. So my question is, how do you actually see the school remaining as an attractant for people who don't really have to go there, particularly people with means? And what kind of skills would you need? I don't even know whether they come from the teaching profession at all, to be able to orchestrate the school so there is a place for young people and not so young people to basically practice civics.
Ted, you want to jump in on this?
So I didn't get to answer will the whole system blow up? So I'm going to take Howard's question as an opportunity to throw my 2 cents in. So I think the system is going to be a lot more different than I think we've heard so far. Because, Howard, I think that we're going to pretty quickly divide up 3 different functions of school. So I think the goal that we ought to have in mind is preparing the next generations of kids to be able to work together to solve complicated problems using processes, skills, and a knowledge base that they accumulate. So if you've got those 5 things and are willing to hold on to those for a second, schools need to be places where that happens. So the accumulating the knowledge and some of the skills is probably automatable. I think that there is a lot that we can do online through some of the adaptive technologies to be able to accumulate that knowledge, or at least to access it. But the trick is going to be to create the set of problems that are interesting enough, that ought to be connected to the community, and the insistence to work together, both in a physical place called school and across boundaries using social networks, in order to be able to take those skills and that knowledge base and to put it together into a stew that I think I would agree with you is the basis not only of economic life and economic competitiveness, but really civic life. It is a democracy in action. I think that requires a very different approach to what teaching is, a very different approach to what it means to run a school. It creates a lot of problems that we can only see the front edges of. So I may just be reinforcing your question, but I think that that's how we have to start thinking about putting these pieces together. And certainly, the technology is going to enable us to do things differently, but I don't think that it provides a simple software solution for how to do that stuff.
Can I, just for clarification, then are you saying you do think that school and learning as we know it is going to blow up? Is that what you're saying?
I do,
It's
but
going to be different.
I think it's going to be very different. So I think that kids are going to accumulate badges around skill sets, and that's going to replace seat time. But those badges aren't going to replace what we mean when we say a kid is educated. What we mean when we say a kid is educated is much more about what Howard was talking about, the ability to work together in unfamiliar groups to solve challenging problems whose outcome is not predetermined.
What the dilemma is that I think 10 years from now, 20 years from now, schooling will look very, very different than any of us imagine right now. And the real question is, are we up to the task? Meaning, are we going to have, this is where, frankly, I actually think collective bargaining is going to be very essential. Are we going to end up having enough kind of tools, trust, and time for teachers that they will walk through a very unknown environment and try and do a lot of different things, like people are starting to try to do in New Haven, like they're trying to do in Poway, like they're trying to do in some of the places that Miles is talking about. But this notion that Howard has raised about education being, and sorry to put words in your mouth, but this notion of democratic citizenry and education and the military being one of the only places where that kind of communitarianism actually happens, I think it's very essential that we keep those notions of community as schools as communities.
I'm going to get another question in here. We've got someone down here in the front trying to go boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl.
Hi, I think I'm the first teacher to speak today during this session. I'm sorry?
All day?
Well, during this particular session.
Oh, this session, okay.
I just want to share a couple of stories, which is schools have already changed. Teachers are already using technology in many different innovative ways. I use technology in my classroom. So for example.
What grade do you teach?
I teach high school. I use blogs. I'm an English teacher, and I teach all kinds of critical thinking, expository writing, analytical thinking. And we use blogs to create some of the writing assignments that students use every single day. So for example, Randi, you mentioned how we need to use technology to connect students to the outside world. I gave a group of my students an article from The Nation to respond to. And it actually had to do with technology, and they responded to it in an assignment. The author of that article wound up responding to one of the students on the blog. So what I'm trying to say here is, and I know we are limited on time, the contract between the old English teacher, which was the student hands in the paper, and it gets graded and it gets handed back, that's done and over with. Writing has become a public kind of space now. And we give young people a sense of urgency and a sense of visibility when we say, your writing actually means something beyond giving it to a teacher to grade. When the author of The Nation writes back to my student, who by the way was a student of color, first generation kid, Dominican, gonna go to college for her entire family, when that author writes back to that post that she wrote on that blog, it means the world to her.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Same with
that's certainly
citizen
empowering.
scientists. It's happening in a lot of these different domains. I think you're absolutely right, but we're still in the infancy. We're
We've
still
got
at the
robotics.
beginning of the trend, but you're right, that's going to be transformative for kids as well as for teachers.
We've got about 3 minutes left. Let's try and get as many questions as we can, and in 3 minutes, let's see female, male. So if we can, let's quickly ask a question for the panel real quick. We've only got 3 minutes left.
I wonder whether technology is going to lower the barriers to people who want to do alternative modes of education for homeschooling parents, for example, or for alternative forms of private schools, perhaps even homeschooling parents who are relying in part on online instruction produced by public schools. And I wonder if that's going to be a disruptive effect for what you guys think.
No. Well, for sure. Simple question, simple answer. Absolutely. I mean, we see it now.
It
that
already is.
a lot of our users are homeschool users that have a way to take their kids that are being homeschooled and connect them to a broader world and supplement their environment that way. So it makes it less pressure for a parent with homeschooled kids to figure out a way to have their homeschooled student collaborate with other students, just as one example.
So we support school-facing technologies because we think that that is a force of nature, but we think that the technology has to enable the kind of democratic civic participation that we've been talking about in the last 10 minutes.
Question over here.
Hi, Chris Smith from Vermont Technical College, professor of English. I'm wondering if schools are going to become places of increased experimentation and implementation and collaboration, how far from Dewey's definition of experiential education have we come? And if so, the only missing piece may be students' and teachers' reflection on the use of that technology.
If we succeed, we will have a society that is worthy, democratic, and whole, to quote Dewey.
Absolutely.
Quick one over here. We only got 2 more questions, so raise your hand high. Okay, right there. She had the most aggressive wave.
I'm Judy Lefton from Miami, Florida, Out Loud Multimedia, ages 16 to 25. I'm fabulous to hear about the teachers and the tools and the connections that you're giving them, but there's been a lot of controversy in the publications regarding the development of the young brain, as far as the different lobes and how technology can stunt its growth, and where things are stored, whether it's short-term memory, long-term memory, and the ability to do critical thinking and crossovers from right brain, left brain. So have you focused in that formula at all in what you're building for the next group coming through?
Miles, are you thinking about left brain, right brain?
Well, I think about getting kids out of one-to-one relationships with technology, which I think helps address that. I mean,
So it's a little off topic, but early childhood. A third of the achieving gap is because kids don't have access to early childhood. And if we could do one thing in America better, we could give all low-income 3-, 4-, and 5-year-olds early childhood education.
Okay, last question.
agree with that.
Last question, right there.
Hi, I'm another teacher. I'm a high school math teacher, and two quick comments. Again, I reiterate, have been using technology since I've been teaching for the last 12 years, whether it's a website where lessons are online, parents, students can see the learning objective, the assignment, tests, have links to support, or in the classroom with graphing.
So it's there. So your questions quickly?
Yeah, so my question, well, maybe it's more of a comment, but I think teachers learn best from other teachers, and teachers want to do a good job. And I don't mean a teacher that now works for a tech firm that comes in. They learn from their colleagues.
Exactly.
And we have a lot of technology in our school system, smart boards that are used as room dividers, and bulletin boards, and whiteboards, which is a shame. But what works best is when a teacher pilots a technology and tries it. We had a teacher last year who got a cart of iPads, and a young teacher, and younger than I am, and she used it, and everyone kind of noticed and said, we asked, does it work? What kinds of things are you doing? And when teachers see other teachers trying things, and it works, they want it. that's when schools should buy it. No technology should be purchased for more than a teacher, I think, at a time. And have somebody pilot it. Use the model from business, which is to have a product champion, to have somebody who thinks and has tested something and finds that it works. And then if it does, other teachers will want it. It's got to come from the teachers and from with support from the principals and the administration. But it only works if the teachers are invested in it, they see that it works, and they see other people using it. And
So do
effectively.
me a big favor.
Sure.
Share that technology and that lesson that you guys have done on Share My Lesson.
Absolutely.
I will. Thank you.
On that point about sharing and technology, I want to thank our panel. They were terrific. And